This is a story of Agatha Christie, The Case of the Rich Woman, a Parker Pine mystery. But before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on amazing stories like this. The name of Mrs. Abner, RYR, was brought to Mr. Parker Pine. He knew the name, and he raised his eyebrows. Presently his client was shown into the room. Mrs. Ryer was a tall woman, big bone. Her figure was ungainly, and the velvet dress and the heavy fur coat she wore did not disguise the fact the knuckles of her large hands were pronounced. Her face was big and broad, and highly colored. Her black hair was fashionably dressed, and there were many tips of curled ostrich in her hat. She plumped herself down on a chair with a gnawed good morning. She said her voice had a rough accent. "If you're any good at all, you'll tell me how to spend my money," most original murmured Mr. Parker Pine. Few asked that in these days. "So you really find it difficult, Mrs. Rymer?" "Yes, I do," said the lady bluntly. "I've got 3 fur coats, a lot of Paris dresses, and such like. I've got a car and a house in Park Lane. I've had a yacht, but I don't like to see I've got a lot of those high-class servants that look down their nose at you. I've traveled a bit and seen foreign parts, and I'm blessed if I can think of anything more to buy." Or do she look hopefully at Mr. Pine? "There are hospitals." He said, "What giveaway? You mean no, that I won't do that. Money was work for, let me tell you, work for hard. If you think I'm going to hand out like so much dirt, well, you're mistaken. I want to spend it, and get some good out of it. Now, if you've got any ideas that are worthwhile in that line, you could depend on a good fee. Your proposition interests me," said Mr. Pine. "You do not mention a country house. I forgot it. But I've got one BS me to death. You must tell me more about yourself. Your problem is not easy to solve. I'll tell you unwilling. I'm not ashamed of what I've come from work in a farmhouse. I did when I was a girl. Hard work it was too. Then I took up with Abner. He was a workman in the mills nearby. He sed me for 8 years, and then we got married." "And you were happy?" asked Mr. Pine. He was a good man to me, Abner. We had a hard struggle of it, though he was out of job twice and children coming along, for we had 3 boys and a girl, and none of them lived to grow up. I dare say it would have been different if they had. Her face softened, looked suddenly younger. His chest was weak. Abner was they wouldn't take him for the war. He did well at home. He was made foreman. He was a clever fellow, Abner. He worked out a process. They treated him fair, I will say, gave him a good sum. For it, he used that money for another idea of his that brought him money hand over fist. He was a master now, employ his own workmen. He bought 2 concerns that were bankrupt and made them pay. The rest was easy money, came in hand over fist. It's still coming, and mind you, it was rare fun at first having a house and a tip-top bathroom, and servants of one's own. No more cooking and scrubbing and washing. Do just sit back on your silk cushions in the drawing room and ring the bell for tea like NECST. Might grand fun it was, and we enjoyed it. And then we came up to London. I went to swell dressmakers for my clothes. We went to Paris, and the Riviera. Rare fun it was." And then said Mr. Parker Pine, "We got used to it, I suppose," said Mrs. Rymer. "After a bit, it didn't seem so much fun. Why, there were days when we didn't even fancy our meals properly, us, with any dish we fancy to choose from. As for baths, well, in the end, 1 bath a day is enough for anyone, and Abner's health began to worry him. Paid good money to doctors, we did, but they couldn't do anything. They tried this and they tried that, but it was no use. He died." She paused. "He was a young man, only 43. Mr. Pine nodded sympathetically. "That was 5 years ago. Money still rolling, and it seems wasteful not to be able to do anything with it. But as I tell you, I can't think of anything else to buy that I haven't got already." "In other words," said Mr. Pine, "your life is dull. You are not enjoying it." "I'm sick of it," said Mrs. Rymer gloomily. "I've no friends and new. Lot only want subscriptions, and they laugh at me behind my back. The old lot won't have anything to do with me. My rolling up in a car makes them shy. Can you do anything or suggest anything it is possible that I can?" said Mr. Pine slowly. "It will be difficult, but I believe there's a chance of success. I think it's possible I can give you back what you have lost, your interest in life." "How?" demanded Mrs. Rymer curtly. That said Mr. Parker Pine, "is my professional secret. I never disclose my methods beforehand. The question is, will you take a chance? I do not guarantee success, but I do think there is a reasoned possibility of it. And how much will it cost? I shall have to adopt unusual methods, and therefore it will be expensive. My charges will be £1,000 payable in advance." "You can open your mouth. All right, can't you?" said Mrs. Rymer appreciatively. "Well, I'll risk it. I'm used to paying top price. Only when I pay for a thing I take good care that I get. You shall get it," said Mr. Parker Pine. "Never fear. I'll send you the check this evening," said Mrs. Rymer, rising, I'm sure. I don't know why I should trust you fools, and their money are soon parted, they say. I dare say I'm a fool you got nerve to advertise in all the papers that you can make people happy. Those advertisements cost me money. Said Mr. Pine, if I could not make my words good, that money would be wasted. I know what causes unhappiness, and consequently, I have a clear idea of how to produce an opposite condition. Mrs. Rymer shook her head doubtfully and departed, leaving a cloud of expensive mixed essences behind her. The handsome Claude Luttrell strolled into the office, something in my line. Mr. Pine shook his head. Nothing so simple. He said, no, this is a difficult case. We must, I fear, take a few risks. We must attempt the unusual. Mrs. Oliver. Mr. Pine smiled at the mention of the word world-famous novelist. Mrs. Oliver, he said, is really the most conventional of all of us. I have in mind a bold and audacious coup. By the way, you might ring up Dr. Umbooze. Yes, his services will be needed. A week later, Mrs. Ryer once more entered Mr. Parker Pine's office. He rose to receive her. This delay, I assure you, has been necessary. He said many things had to be arranged, and I had to secure the services of an unusual man who had to come half across Europe. Oh, she said it suspiciously. It was constantly present in her mind that she had paid out a check for £1,000, and the check had been cashed. Mr. Parker Pine touched a buzzer. A young girl, dark oriental-looking, but dressed in white nurse's kit, answered it. Is everything ready, Nurse O'Hara? Yes, Dr. Constantine is waiting. What are you going to do? Asked Mrs. Rymer with a touch of uneasiness. Introduce you to some Eastern magic, dear lady, said Mr. Parker Pine. Mrs. Rymer followed the nurse up to the next floor. Here she was ushered into a room that bore no relation to the rest of the house. Oriental embroideries covered the walls. There were divans with soft cushions and beautiful rugs on the floor. A man was bending over a coffee pot. He straightened as they entered. Dr. Constantine, said the nurse. The doctor was dressed in European clothes, but his face was sthy, and his eyes were dark and oblique with a peculiarly piercing power in their glance. So this is my patient, he said in a low, vibrant voice. I'm not a patient, said Mrs. Rymer. Your body is not sick, said the doctor, but your soul is weary with the East know how to cure that disease. Sit down and drink a cup of coffee. Mrs. Ramirez sat down and accepted a tiny cup of the fragrant brew. As she sipped it, the doctor talked. Here in the West, they treat only the body, mistake the body is only the instrument. A tune is played upon it. It may be a sad, weary tune. It may be a gay tune, full of delight. That last is what we shall give you. You have money, you shall spend it, and enjoy life shall be worth living again. It is easy, so easy. A feeling alert crept over Mrs. Rymer. The figures of the doctor and the nurse grew hazy. She felt blissfully happy and very sleepy. The doctor's figure grew bigger. The whole world was growing bigger. The doctor was looking into her eyes. Sleep. He was saying, sleep, your eyelids are closing soon. You will sleep, you will sleep, you will sleep. Mrs. Rymer's eyelids closed. She flowed with a wonderful, great, big whirl. When her eyes opened, it seemed to her that a long time had passed. She remembered several things, vaguely strange, impossible dreams, and a feeling of waking, then further dreams. She remembered something about a car and the dark, beautiful girl in nurse's uniform bending over her. Anyway, she was properly awake now, and in her own bed. At least was it her own bed? It felt different. It lacked the delicious softness of her own bed. It was vaguely reminiscent of days almost forgotten. She moved, and it creaked. Mrs. Rymer's bed in Park Lane never creaked. She looked round decidedly. This was not Park Lane. Was it a hospital? No, she decided, not a hospital, nor was it a hotel. It was a bare room, the walls an uncertain shade of lilac. There was a deal washstand with jug and basin upon it. There was a deal chest of drawers and a tin trunk. There were unfamiliar clothes hanging on pegs. There was the bed covered with a much-mended quilt, and there was herself in it. Where am I? Said Mrs. Rymer. The door opened, and a plump little woman bustled in. She had red cheeks and a good-humored air. Her sleeves were rolled up, and she wore an apron there. She exclaimed, she's awake. Come in, doctor. Mrs. Rymer opened her mouth to say several things, but they remained unsaid, for the man who followed the plump woman into the room was not in the least like the elegant, swarthy Dr. Constantine. He was a bent old man who peered through thick glasses. That's better, he said, advancing to the bed and taking up Mrs. Rymer's wrist. You'll soon be better now. My dear, what's been the matter with me? Demanded Mrs. Rymer. You had a kind of seizure, said the doctor. You've been unconscious for a day or two. Nothing to worry about. Gave us a fright. You did, Hannah, said the plump woman. You've been raving too, saying the oddest things. Yes, Mrs. Gardner, said the doctor oppressively. But we mustn't excite the patient. You'll soon be up and about again, my dear. But don't you worry about the work, Hannah, said Mrs. Gardner. Mrs. Robert has been in to give me a hand, and we got on fine. Just lie still And get well, my dear, why do you call me Hannah, said Mrs. Rymer. Well, it's your name, said Mrs. Gardner, bewildered. No, it isn't my name, it's Amelia Rymer. Mrs. Abner Ryer, the doctor, and Mrs. Gardner exchanged glances. Well, just you lie still, said Mrs. Gardner. Yes, no worry, said the doctor. They withdrew. Mrs. Rymer lay puzzling. Why did they call her Hannah? And why had they exchanged that glance of amused incredulity when she had given them her name? Where was she? And what had happened? She slipped out of bed. She felt a little uncertain on her legs, but she walked slowly to the small dormer window and looked out on a farmyard, completely mystified. She went back to bed. What was she doing in a farmhouse that she had never seen before? Mrs. Gardner re-entered the room with a bowl of soup on a tray. Mrs. Rymer began her questions. What am I doing in this house? She demanded. Who brought me? Here nobody brought you, my dear. It's your home. Leastways, you've lived here for the last 5 years. I mean, not suspecting once that you were liable to fits lived here 5 years. That's right. Why, Hannah, you don't mean that you still don't remember? I've never lived here. I've never seen you before you see you've had this illness. And you've forgotten I've never lived here. But you have. My suddenly Mrs. Gardner darted across to the chest of drawers and brought to Mrs. Rymer a faded photograph and a frame it. Represented a group of 4 persons, a bearded man, a plump woman, Mrs. Gardner, a tall lank maid with a pleasantly sheepish grin, and somebody in a prim dress, an apron herself stupefied. Mrs. Rymer gazed at the photograph. Mrs. Gardner put the soup down beside her and quietly left the room. Mrs. Rymer sipped the soup mechanically. It was good soup, strong and hot all the time. Her brain was in a whirl. Who was mad? Mrs. Gardner or herself? One of them must be. But there was the doctor, too. I'm Amelia Rymer, she said firmly to herself. I know I'm Elia Rymer, and nobody's going to tell me different. She had finished the soup. She put the bowl back, where the tray of folded newspaper caught her eye, and she picked it up and looked at the date on it, October 19th. What day had she gone to Mr. Parker Pine's office? Either the 15th or the 16th. Then she must have been ill for 3 days. That rascally doctor said. Mrs. Rymer wrathfully, all the same, she was as shade relieved. She had heard of cases where people had forgotten who they were for years at a time. She had been afraid some such thing had happened to her. She began turning the pages of the paper, scanning the columns idly, when suddenly a paragraph caught her. I'm Mrs. Abner Rymer, widow of Abner Ryer the Button Shank King, was removed yesterday to a private home for mental cases for the past 2 days. She has persisted in declaring she was not herself, but a servant girl named Hannah Morius. Hannah Morius. So that's it, said Mrs. Rymer. She's me, and I'm her kind of. Double, I suppose. Well, we can soon put that right if that oily hypocrite of Parker Pine is up to some game or other. But at this minute I was caught by the name Constantine staring at her from the printed page. This time it was a headline. Dr. Constantine's claim at a farewell lecture given last night on the eve of his departure for Japan. Dr. Claudius Constantine advanced some startling theories. He declared that it was possible to prove the existence of the soul by transferring a soul from one body to another. In the course of his experiments in the East, he claimed successfully effected a double transfer of the soul of a hypnotized body of being transferred to a hypnotized body B, and the soul of B the body of on recovering from hypnotic sleep. Declared herself to be B, and B thought herself to be it. For the experiment to succeed, it was necessary to find 2 people with a great bodily resemblance. It was an undoubted fact that 2 people resembling each other were on rapport. This was very noticeable in the case of twins, but 2 strangers varying widely in social position, but with a marked similarity of feature, were found to exhibit the same harmony of structure. Mrs. Rymer cast the paper from her. The scoundrel, the black scoundrel, she saw the whole thing now. It was a dastardly plot to get hold of her money. This Hannah Morius was Mr. Pine's tool, possibly an innocent one, and that devil Constantine had brought off this fantastic coup. But she'd expose him, she'd show him up, she'd have the lure on him, she'd tell everyone abruptly. Mrs. Rymer came to a stop in the tide of her indignation. She remembered that first paragraph. Hannah Mose had not been a docile tool. She had protested, had declared her individuality, and what had happened clapped into a lunatic asylum. Poor girl, said Mrs. Rymer. A chill ran down her spine. A lunatic asylum. They got you in there, and they never let you get out. The more you said you were sane, the less they believed you. There you were. And there you stayed. No, Mrs. Rymer wasn't going to run the risk of that. The door opened, and Mrs. Gardner came in. You've drunk your soup, my dear. That's good. You'll soon be better now. When was I taken ill? Demanded Mrs. Rymer. Let me. See, it was 3 days ago on Wednesday, that was the 15th, you were took bed about 4 o'clock. The ejaculation was fraught with meaning. It had been just about 4 o'clock when Mrs. Reimer had entered the presence of Dr. Constantine. You slipped down in your chair, said, Mrs. Gardner. Oh, you says, oh, just like that. And then, I'm falling asleep, you says in a dreamy voice, I'm falling asleep. And asleep you did, and we put you to bed and sent for the doctor. And here you've been ever since, I suppose, Mrs. Reimer ventured there. Isn't any way you can know who I am apart from my face? I mean, well, that's a queer thing to say, said Mrs. Gardner. What is there to go by better than a person's face? I'd like to know there's your birthmark, though if that satisfies you, better a birthmark, said Mrs. Reimer, brightening. She had no such thing, strawberry mark, just under the right elbow, said Mrs. Gardner. Look for yourself, my dear, this will prove it, said Mrs. Reimer herself. She knew that she had no strawberry mark under the right elbow. She turned back the sleeve of her night dress. The strawberry mark was there. Mrs. Reimer burst into tears. 4 days later, Mrs. Reimer rose from her bed. She had thought out several plans of action and rejected them. She might show the paragraph in the paper to Mrs. Gardner and the doctor and explain would they believe her. Mrs. Reimer was sure they would not. She might go to police. Would they believe her again? She thought not. She might go to Mr. Pine's office. That idea undoubtedly pleased her best for one thing. She would like to tell that oily scoundrel what she thought of him. She was debarred from putting this plan into operation by a vital obstacle. She was at present in Cornwall, as she had learned, and she had no money for the journey to London too, and 4p in a worn purse seemed to represent her financial position. And so after 4 days, Mrs. Reimer made a sporting decision. For the present, she would accept things. She was Hannah Morius very. Well, she would be Hannah Morius. For the present, she would accept the role, and later, when she had saved sufficient money, she would go to London and beard the swindler in his den. And having thus decided, Mrs. Reimer accepted her role with perfect good temper, even with a kind of sardonic amusement. History was repeating itself. Indeed, this life here reminded her of her girlhood. How long ago that seemed the work was a bit hard after her years of soft living. But after the first week, she found herself slipping into the ways of the farm. Mrs. Gardner was a good-tempered, kindly woman. Her husband, a big, taciturn man, was kindly. Also, the lank, shambling man of the photograph had gone, and another farm-hand came instead, a good, humored giant of 45, slow of speech and thought, but with shy twinkle as blue eyes of weeks. When by at last a day came when Reimer had enough money to pay her fare to London. But she did not go. She put it off time enough. She thought she wasn't easy in her mind about asylums. Yet that scoundrel Marpine was clever. He'd get a doctor to say she was mad, and she'd be clapped out of sight with no one knowing anything about it. Besides, said Mrs. Reimer to herself, a bit of change does one good. She rose early and worked hard. Joe Welsh, the new farm-man, was ill that winter, and she and Mrs. Gardner, nursing the big man, was pathetically dependent on them. Spring came lambing time. There were wild flowers in the hedges, a treacherous softness in the air. Joe Welsh gave Hannah a hand with her work. Hannah did Joe's mending sometimes on Sundays. They went for a walk together. Joe was a widower. His wife had died for years before. Since her death, he frankly confessed, had taken a drop too much. He didn't go much to Crown nowadays. He bought himself some new clothes, Mr. And Mrs. Gardner laughed. Hannah made fun of Joe. She teased him about his clumsiness. Joe didn't mind. He looked bashful, but happy. After spring came summer, a good summer. That year, everyone worked hard. Harvest was over. The leaves were red and golden on the trees. It was October 8th, when Hannah looked up one day from a cabbage she was cutting and saw Mr. Parker Pine leaning over the fence. You said Hannah, alias Mrs. Reimer. It was some time before she got all out, and when she had said her say, she was out of breath. Mr. Parker Pine smiled blandly. I quite agree with you. He said, a cheat and a liar, that's what you are, said Mrs. Reimer, repeating herself. You with your Constantines and your hypnotizing, and that poor girl Hannah Morius shut up with loonies. No, said Mr. Parker Pine, there you misjudge me. Hannah Morius is not in a lunatic asylum, because Hannah Morius never existed. Indeed, said Mrs. Reimer. And what about the photograph of her that I saw with my own eyes? Fake said Mr. Pine. Quite a simple thing to manage. And the piece in the paper about her, the whole paper was faked, so as to include items in a natural manner which would carry conviction, as it did that rogue doctor. Constantine, an assumed name assumed by a friend of mine with a talent for acting. Mrs. Reimer snorted. Oh, and I wasn't hypnotized either, I suppose. As a matter of fact, you were not. You drank your coffee, a preparation of Indian hemp, after that other drugs were administered, and you were brought down here by car and allowed to recover consciousness. Then Mrs. Gardner has been in all the time, said Mrs. Reimer. Mr. Parker Pine not bribed by you, I suppose, or filled up a lot of lies, Mrs. Gardner, trust me, said Mr. Pine. I save her only son from penal servitude. Something in his manner silenced. Mrs. Reimer on the tack, what about the birthmark? She demanded. Mr. Pine smiled. It is already fading. In another 6 months. It will have disappeared altogether. And what's the meaning of all this tomfoolery, making a fool of me, sticking me down here as a servant me with all that good money in the bank? But I suppose I need ask you've been helping yourself to my fine fellow. That's the meaning of all this. It is true, said Mr. Parker Pine, that I did obtain from you, while you were under the influence of drugs, a power of attorney, and that during your absence I have assumed control of your financial affairs. But I can assure you, my dear madam, that apart from that original 000 no money of yours has found its way into my pocket. As a matter of fact, by judicious investments, your financial position is actually improved. He beamed at her. Then why, began Mrs. Reimer. I'm going to ask you a question, Mrs. Reimer said. Mr. Pine, you are an honest woman. You will answer me honestly. I know. I'm going to ask you if you are happy. That's a pretty question, steal a woman's money. And ask her if she's happy. I like your impudence. You are still angry, he said. Most natural, but leave my misdeeds out of the moment. Mrs. Reimer, when you came to my office a year ago today, you were an unhappy woman. Will you tell me that you are unhappy now? If so, I apologize, and you are at liberty to take what steps you please against me. Moreover, I will refund you the 000 you paid me. Come, Mrs. Reimer. Are you an unhappy woman now? Mrs. Reimer looked at Mr. Parker Pine, but she dropped her eyes when she spoke at last. No, she said, I'm not unhappy. A tone of wonder crept into her voice. You got me there. I admit it. I've not been as happy as I am now since Abner died. I'm going to marry a man who works here, Joe. Welsh, our bands are going up next Sunday. That is, they were going up next Sunday. But now, of course, said Mr. Pine, everything is different. Mrs. Reimer's face flamed. She took a step forward. What do you mean different? Do you think if I had all the money in the world, it would make me a lady? I don't want to be a lady. Thank you, a helpless good for nothing lot they are. Joe's good enough for me, and I'm good enough for him. We suit each other, and we're going to be happy. As for you, Mr. Nosey Parker, you take yourself off, and don't interfere with what doesn't concern you. Mr. Parker Pine took a paper from his pocket and handed it to her, the power of attorney. He said, shall I tear it up? You will assume control of your own fortune now. I take a strange expression came over Mrs. Reimer's face. She thrust back the paper. Take it. I've said hard things to you, and some of them you deserve. You're a dowy fellow, but all the same, I trust you. 700 pounds I'll have in the bank here. That'll buy us a farm. We got our eye on the rest of it. Well, let the hospitals have it. You cannot mean to hand over your entire fortune to hospitals. That's just what I do mean. Joe's a dear good fellow, but he's weak. Give him money. And you'd ruin him. I've got him off the drink now, and I'll keep him off it. Thank God. I know my own mind. I'm not going to let money come between me and happiness. You are a remarkable woman, said Mr. Pine slowly. Only one woman in 1,000 would act as you are doing. Then only one woman in 1,000's got sense, said Mrs. Reimer. I take off my hat to you, said Mr. Parker Pine, and there was an unusual note in his voice. He raised his hat with solemnity and moved away, and Joe's never to know mine. Mrs. Reimer called after him. She stood there with the dying sun behind her, a great blue-green cabbage in her hands, her head thrown back, and her shoulders squared, a grand figure of a peasant woman outlined against the setting sun. Thank you very much for listening to this story.